You think cartel wars only happen on the dusty streets of Mexico City or along the Rio Grande? But what if I told you the next cartel stronghold isn't south of the border? It's right here, in the quiet heart of America. In a Tennessee town where families still leave their doors unlocked, in a small Ohio community that celebrates Friday night football like a ritual, and in the farmlands of Oklahoma where everyone knows everyone by name. These towns look peaceful, even idyllic, but beneath their calm surfaces, something dark is spreading. A hidden war is unfolding, one that few talk about but many already feel. And the people caught in it are not soldiers on distant battlefields, they're neighbors, teachers, pastors, and local cops suddenly facing an enemy that doesn't wear uniforms or fly flags. In 2025, the DEA quietly initiated what internal sources later called the Silent Frontline Initiative, a secretive campaign designed to dismantle cartel operations within U.S. borders before they could fully entrench. For years, the agency had been watching an invisible shift. Cartels were no longer just exporting drugs, they were exporting control. Instead of smuggling across dangerous borders, they began embedding themselves into the veins of small-town America, using legitimate fronts, local accomplices, and the blind spots of law enforcement. Their strategy was genius in its simplicity. Go where no one expects you. In small towns with limited police presence, cheap land, and struggling economies, they found everything they needed to thrive unnoticed. By 2024, over 60% of methamphetamine seized in Middle America was traced back to Jalisco, Mexico, but not from shipments crossing the border. These drugs were being produced inside the United States itself, in hidden labs scattered across barns, storage units, and old auto shops. Farmers were unknowingly renting their land to cartel-connected companies. Bankers were approving small business loans to shell corporations with clean paperwork but dirty money. Even some local politicians, desperate to attract new business, turned a blind eye to the warning signs. What looked like economic revival in dying towns was, in reality, cartel infiltration on a scale never seen before. Imagine waking up one morning to the news that your neighbor's teenage son has overdosed. The sheriff calls it another fentanyl case, the latest in a growing list. But what most people don't see is the vast chain behind that one death. The cartel chemists mixing the product in Michoacan, the truck drivers moving it through rural highways, the street-level distributors who blend in with local workers. Somewhere along that path, someone in authority allowed it to happen. By choice, by corruption, or by fear. This is not just about drugs, it's about power, control, and the slow transformation of communities that once seemed untouchable. It started quietly, too quietly. Between 2018 and 2023, law enforcement noticed a strange pattern. An explosion of overdoses, not in the inner cities, but in small, isolated American towns. Tennessee saw a 42% rise in synthetic opioid deaths. In parts of Oklahoma, entire counties reported more meth seizures in a year than Los Angeles. But how? These weren't typical trafficking hotspots. The roads were empty, the sheriff's offices underfunded, and the population aging. Yet the flow of narcotics was relentless. The DEA began to see what few others could. The cartels were adapting not by brute force, but by invisibility. They weren't storming America's front door, they were quietly renting a room inside. The first sign came from a seemingly minor bust in Franklin County, Tennessee. Local deputies had stopped a pickup truck with no license plates, only to discover $2 million in cash vacuum-sealed in the seats. The driver was a farm contractor with no criminal record, no ties to Mexico, and no explanation. What followed was a slow unspooling of a nationwide web. That same contractor had wired money to shell companies in Guadalajara, companies that turned out to be owned by proxies of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. The DEA's analysts began piecing together data from banks, trucking manifests, and rural business registrations, a hidden network of money and influence that reached from Nashville to Norman. This wasn't just about smuggling drugs. The cartels were embedding themselves into the fabric of American life. They bought failing farms under the guise of agri-tech companies, started transport businesses that moved produce, and invested in rural real estate. The brilliance of the plan was its banality. To the untrained eye, nothing seemed suspicious. A new construction company, a small dairy business, a growing trucking fleet. But the deeper agents looked, the more they realized these were operational fronts. They allowed cartels to ship products, launder profits, and hide operatives in plain sight. The rural economy, desperate for any sign of investment, welcomed them with open arms. Oklahoma's panhandle became a case study in infiltration. With its endless flatlands and empty highways, it was the perfect environment for moving large quantities of illicit goods undetected. DEA informants revealed that cartel chemists were setting up shadow labs, portable chemical stations that could be dismantled in hours. They cooked meth and synthetic opioids using precursor chemicals imported through legitimate agricultural shipments. Each time the DEA got close, the lab vanished, leaving behind only chemical residue and burned soil. These labs weren't run by cartel soldiers. They were often managed by American citizens recruited through desperation. Farmers in debt, veterans struggling with addiction, small business owners lured by fast money. By 2024, the DEA had uncovered more than 200 small-town distribution hubs operating under the radar, each feeding multiple states. These weren't chaotic street gangs. They were logistics operations run like corporations. Every transaction, every shipment, every recruit was meticulously planned. The DEA's surveillance teams discovered that encrypted apps were being used to manage distribution routes. Money was laundered through digital wallets, then reinvested into legitimate businesses. The cartels had evolved beyond the image of tattooed gunmen. This was now white-collar crime with rural camouflage. Behind the scenes, the DEA began to realize the enormity of the task. They were no longer fighting a cross-border problem. They were fighting a domestic insurgency powered by corruption, poverty, and digital precision. One senior agent described it as, "Fighting smoke. It's everywhere, but you can't grab it." The small towns, once symbols of American safety and pride, had unknowingly become the new front lines of an invisible war. Local police departments lacked the funding or expertise to handle such sophisticated operations. Even when they did uncover a clue, the jurisdictional red tape often meant it was too late. The question haunting investigators was simple. How deep had it gone? How many communities were already compromised? For every raid that made headlines, there were a dozen towns quietly losing their fight. Schools overrun with addiction, hospitals overwhelmed with overdoses, and families torn apart by an enemy they couldn't see. This was not just a criminal enterprise. It was social corrosion, spreading like wildfire under the radar. The DEA's mission was no longer just about seizures. It was about saving the very structure of small-town America before it collapsed from within. The realization hit hard. Cartels had learned America's weak spots better than anyone else. They didn't just cross the border. They crossed the cultural threshold. They learned the language, the laws, and the loopholes. They replaced brute force with subtlety and violence with business acumen. The DEA now faced a terrifying new landscape, one where the enemy no longer came with gunfire, but with a handshake and a business card. It started quietly, so quietly that most people didn't even notice. The first signs appeared not in big cities, but in America's forgotten places. In 2018, DEA field reports began showing strange financial patterns in Tennessee, Oklahoma, and southern Ohio. Towns that had no prior record of major narcotics operations suddenly saw spikes in cash transactions, vehicle purchases, and property rentals. These were small anomalies on paper, but for veteran analysts, they looked eerily familiar. It was the same pattern once seen in Mexican border towns before cartel consolidation. Someone was moving in, but they weren't drawing attention with violence or flashy operations. They were embedding themselves like roots beneath the surface. At first, law enforcement didn't connect the dots. The fentanyl crisis had already overwhelmed local police, who were focusing on overdoses, not infrastructure. Cartels exploited that. They used small trucking companies, legitimate construction firms, and agricultural fronts as cover for their real business. In Tennessee, a shell company called Green Valley Transport became the perfect example. On paper, it was a freight service moving livestock and produce. In reality, it was a logistics hub for moving precursor chemicals and cash across state lines. The operation was clean, subtle, and invisible to the untrained eye. The infiltration wasn't random, it was strategic. The cartels knew that America's rural heartland had what they lacked: space, low law enforcement presence, and isolation. Unlike urban centers, where surveillance and competition made operations risky, small towns offered silence. An abandoned farm on the outskirts of Pulaski, Tennessee, became a chemical storage site. A disused barn in Ada, Oklahoma, turned into a makeshift lab. Local residents saw trucks come and go, but assumed they were hauling grain or equipment. By the time DEA surveillance caught wind of it, millions of dollars worth of narcotics had already passed through unnoticed. Act 3, Deep Dive, 1,000 words. By the time Operation Dustline went fully active, what the DEA uncovered went far beyond expectations. It was a blueprint for a silent invasion. The cartels had transformed from smuggling organizations into full-fledged logistics empires, hidden within the framework of legitimate American commerce. Every truck route, every warehouse, every mom-and-pop supply company they touched became part of a complex, living organism that fed their billion-dollar pipeline. The DEA analysts working from Quantico and Houston described it best. It's like trying to map a ghost. They weren't dealing with a single network. They were dealing with layers of networks designed to look ordinary. One agent compared it to a digital spider web: cut one strand and the others instantly compensated. Data pulled from seized laptops showed encrypted ledgers, cross-border money transfers disguised as remittance payments, and even AI-assisted logistics planning. That's right, the cartels had begun using machine learning to optimize routes, predict police activity patterns, and minimize risk. What used to be a criminal hustle was now a corporate machine powered by data. Investigators soon found themselves in a race not against men, but against algorithms. The DEA's cyber team started using forensic blockchain analysis to trace the money flow. What they discovered was staggering: a shadow economy hidden inside cryptocurrency exchanges and prepaid digital cards. Tens of millions of dollars were being moved through small, fragmented transactions, small enough to avoid federal detection systems. These microtransactions were then pooled overseas, converted into offshore investments, and quietly reinvested back into U.S. real estate. It wasn't just about drugs anymore. It was about power, economics, and influence. The deeper the agents dug, the clearer the picture became. Cartel engineers had studied America's infrastructure in frightening detail. They knew where highway checkpoints were placed, which counties lacked narcotics K-9 units, and even which local judges were sympathetic to business-related offenses. In Oklahoma, a rural airstrip had been modified with hidden storage compartments built under hangars. In Tennessee, agents found an entire section of an abandoned factory repurposed as a distribution hub, complete with refrigeration systems to disguise chemical odors. What if the DEA's hidden war wasn't enough? What if the infiltration went deeper than anyone imagined, reaching the very heart of American governance, finance, and security? This is the question that began to haunt senior intelligence officials as 2025 approached. Because when they zoomed out, the map told a terrifying story. This wasn't a network localized to the South or Midwest anymore. It was a national grid of influence, quiet, invisible, and disturbingly efficient. Imagine this scenario. A sleepy town in Oklahoma loses power for several hours. Locals blame a storm, but in reality, it's a small, targeted test, a way to measure how quickly local law enforcement reacts, how emergency services communicate, how long it takes for the grid to stabilize. These weren't random disruptions. They were simulations, small-scale field experiments orchestrated by a criminal system testing the resilience of small-town America. If the system could be manipulated at this micro level, then the macro, the state or federal level, would eventually follow. The consequences of such systemic infiltration go far beyond drug shipments or hidden warehouses. This level of control affects voting patterns, law enforcement resource allocation, even real estate trends. Imagine hundreds of small American towns unknowingly being shaped by cartel capital, properties bought, land repurposed, and local elections quietly influenced through community development funds. It's not an invasion of soldiers, it's an invasion of money, and it's far more effective. This hypothetical may sound dystopian, but intelligence reports began hinting at precisely such influence operations. One internal briefing, leaked anonymously, spoke of a parallel economy where cartel wealth had intertwined with local investment ecosystems. Restaurants, trucking firms, construction companies, even small financial institutions, all showed signs of quiet manipulation. It wasn't that these towns were taken over in a Hollywood sense, it was that their financial arteries were being redirected by unseen hands. The war on drugs was never simple, but the war within America's own borders is proving to be even more complex. As the DEA's secret investigations began to uncover the scale of cartel infiltration, the agency faced a harsh reality. Traditional law enforcement tactics weren't enough. Raids, arrests, and seizures might cripple a network temporarily, but they couldn't touch the root, the flow of influence. What America needed now wasn't just muscle. It needed strategy, technology, and public awareness. In 2023, the DEA quietly began shifting its operational philosophy. Instead of focusing solely on narcotics busts, it started developing what insiders call economic counter-infiltration. The idea was simple, yet revolutionary. Fight money with money, intelligence with intelligence. Rather than chasing smugglers, analysts began mapping financial webs, tracing shell corporations, and identifying which small businesses were unknowingly laundering funds. This was a digital war fought not with bullets, but algorithms. Artificial intelligence now plays a major role, scanning thousands of banking records, property deals, and transportation logs for patterns no human could spot. But this new approach also brought tension. Some lawmakers feared it would expand government surveillance too far, especially into rural banking systems. Others argued it was the only way to stop what was rapidly becoming an economic infection. If we don't track their money, we lose the war, one anonymous agent told reporters. Because that's where they've moved the battlefield, into our own ledgers. The DEA also began forming unconventional alliances. Private cybersecurity firms, AI startups, and financial intelligence units started working together to develop predictive models. These systems can now identify suspicious investment surges before they happen, stopping cartel fronts from taking root in small towns. Imagine catching a laundering operation before the first dollar even moves. It's proactive law enforcement, something the DEA never had the resources or technology to attempt before. The final theory shared among insiders is almost philosophical, that the only way to truly defeat a system built on secrecy is through radical transparency, public data access, financial openness, blockchain accountability, tools that could make laundering nearly impossible. In this vision of the future, sunlight becomes the ultimate weapon. Not raids, not arrests, just truth. But until that day comes, agents continue their quiet fight. They move through America's back roads, laptops open, scanning the invisible battlefields of spreadsheets and bank transfers. There are no medals for this kind of warfare, only late nights, blurred eyes, and the constant hum of data. Yet behind that silence, there's a glimmer of hope. For the first time in decades, the DEA isn't just reacting, it's adapting. The war may be secret, but it's not hopeless. Because the same intelligence and innovation that built this modern infiltration can also dismantle it, piece by piece, transaction by transaction, until the heartland belongs to Americans again. And when that day comes, maybe we'll realize the truth. The greatest defense a nation has isn't its weapons, it's its awareness.